3,490 feet. That is the number that water managers across 6 states are watching right now. It is the height at which Lake Powell drops below what engineers call minimum power pool, the point where Glen Canyon Dam can no longer spin its turbines without tearing them apart from the inside. Below that line, 5 million people across the American West lose their electricity. The dam that generates roughly 5 billion kilowatt-hours of power in a normal year goes dark. And as of this week, Lake Powell sits at roughly 30,522 fteth. That is 32 fteth above the shutdown line. It sounds like a cushion until you learn that the lake has dropped more than 30 fteth in the past 12 months alone, that the Bureau of Reclamation's July 2026 forecast projects the reservoir could breach minimum power pool by March of 2027, and that the federal government has already begun draining a second reservoir 400 miles upstream just to keep the water high enough to avoid hitting that number this summer. This is not a drought that comes and goes. This is a dam running out of the one thing it was built to use. And the part that almost nobody is talking about is what happens after the turbines shut down, because the backup system, 4 steel pipes buried inside the dam, has already been damaged, and the Bureau of Reclamation has said in writing that those pipes should not be relied on as the sole means of releasing water. A dam with no power and broken backup plumbing, sitting between 40 million people and the water they need to survive. I am Simon, and this is how we got here. Glen Canyon Dam stands 710 feet above the bedrock of a narrow sandstone canyon in northern Arizona, about 15 miles upstream of the Grand Canyon. Drive into Page, Arizona, a town of roughly 7,300 people that was built in the 1950s as a construction camp for the dam itself, and you will see the canyon walls streaked with the same kind of white mineral stain that marks Lake Mead downstream, a bathtub ring. The high water mark of a reservoir that once stretched 186 miles upstream into southern Utah, flooding side canyons and burying sandstone arches. Today, those side canyons are coming back into view. Former marinas sit on dry rock hundreds of yards from the water. Boat ramps end in cracked dirt. The reservoir that took 17 years to fill is now at roughly 22% of its total capacity, holding about 5.5 million acre-feet out of a top capacity of just over 25 million. What used to be the second largest man-made lake in the United States now holds barely a fifth of what it was designed to store, and the white ring on the canyon walls stretches more than 170 feet above the current waterline. You can stand on the dam's crest and look upstream at a lake that looks more like a wide river winding through bare rock than a national reservoir. The dam was authorized by Congress in 1956 as the centerpiece of the Colorado River Storage Project, a network of dams designed to let the 4 upper basin states store their share of the Colorado River. Construction started that same year. Workers blasted 2 diversion tunnels through the canyon walls, each 3,000 feet long and 45 feet across, to reroute the river while the dam was built. Crews dug 137 feet down to bedrock to lay the foundation. Concrete went up 24 hours a day, delivered in 24-ton buckets swung across the canyon on an aerial tramway, over 400,000 buckets in total. When it was finished in 1963, Glen Canyon Dam contained 4.9 million cubic yards of concrete, stood 5,160 feet across at the top, 25 feet wide at the crest, and 300 feet wide at the base. The first turbine started producing commercial power on September 4, 1964. By 1966, all 8 generating units were running, and the dam was formally dedicated by Lady Bird Johnson. The power plant sits at the base of the dam, embedded in the canyon wall. 8 Francis turbines, each rated at 254,000 horsepower, drive 8 generators with a combined capacity of 1,320 megawatts after upgrades completed between 1985 and 1997. That original capacity was 950 megawatts. The turbines are fed by 8 steel penstocks, each 15 meters in diameter, embedded in the concrete of the dam. The center line of those penstock intakes sits at an elevation of 3,470 feet above sea level. Full pool is 3,700 meters. When the lake is full, the weight of 230 vertical feet of water above those intakes drives the turbines with enormous force. The higher the water, the harder it hits, and the more power the dam pushes onto the grid. For decades, that power was cheap, steady, and reliable. The Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, markets the electricity to roughly 130 wholesale customers serving nearly 5 million people across 6 states, including cities, rural electric cooperatives, irrigation districts, and more than 50 Native American tribes in Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Glen Canyon Dam alone accounts for about 73% of all the generating capacity in WAPA's Salt Lake City Integrated Projects area. It is the backbone of the public power system for a large piece of the rural and tribal West. Now look at what is happening to that backbone. Lake Powell's water elevation this week sits near 35,222 feet. That is roughly 178 feet below full pool. The lake has not been full since the late 1990s. In April 2023, it dropped to a record low of 3,519.92 feet, just 30 feet above the minimum power pool threshold. A brief recovery, fueled by a strong snowpack winter, pushed it back up toward 3,560 feet, and headlines once again announced that the crisis was easing. But the recovery required a record snowpack season at 158% of normal across the upper basin, billions of federal dollars in water conservation payments, and emergency tribal water deals. It took everything the system had to produce a modest rise, and it did not hold. Water year 2026 has been catastrophic. The Bureau of Reclamation's July 2026 forecast projects total unregulated inflow to Lake Powell at just 3.5 million acre-feet for the full water year. That is 36% of the 30-year average. The April through July runoff season, when Rocky Mountain snowmelt is supposed to refill the reservoir, delivered a fraction of what the system needed. Colorado recorded its lowest snowpack in the entire period of modern measurement. Statewide stored snow water on April 1 averaged just 3.3 inches, which is 22% of the 30-year average. The previous worst was 9.1 inches back in 2012. Peak snowpack hit on March 9th, nearly a month early, at just 51% of the average peak. Then came a March that shattered temperature records across the state, with Burlington, Colorado hitting 99 degrees, breaking the all-time state record for the month. The snow did not melt into the river system. It evaporated into warm air and soaked into bone-dry soil before it could ever reach a stream channel. The collapse was not limited to Colorado. Southeastern Utah recorded just 22% of average stored snow water. The Animas and San Juan headwaters, which feed directly into Lake Powell, came in at the mid-40s. NASA satellite images showed snow-covered area across the entire upper basin at roughly 40% of typical early March coverage, the lowest since satellite tracking began in 2001. The July 2026 forecast projects Lake Powell's elevation at 3,507 ft by December 31 of this year, under the most probable scenario. That is just 17 ft above the turbine shutdown line. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover water systems, infrastructure crises, and earth science events like this as they develop with the full picture you need to follow what is happening. The federal government saw this coming months ago and made a desperate move. In April 2026, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum announced an unprecedented operation that water managers have been calling the Great Shuffle. The Bureau of Reclamation authorized the release of between 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet of water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, a dam on the Green River near the Utah-Wyoming border about 400 miles upstream of Lake Powell. The water would flow down the Green River into the Colorado and eventually reach Lake Powell over the next 12 months. At the same time, Reclamation cut the annual release volume from Glen Canyon Dam to Lake Mead by 1.48 million acre-feet, dropping from the normal 7.48 million to just 6 million through September 2026. Less water going out the front, more water coming in the back. Federal officials estimated these combined actions could raise Lake Powell's elevation by roughly 54 ft by spring 2027, enough to keep it above the minimum power pool line. Flaming Gorge sat at about 82% full when the releases began. The operation is expected to drop it by roughly 35 ft over the next year, down to about 59% of capacity. This is not the first time Flaming Gorge has been used as a lifeline. In 2022, the Upper Basin states released 500,000 acre-feet from the same reservoir. This time, the amount is nearly double. Wyoming's water commissioner Brandon Gebhardt warned that the drain will likely close 3 of 5 boat ramps at Flaming Gorge and hurt local fish as the water drops. The recreation economy around the reservoir is taking the hit so that a dam 400 miles downstream can keep its turbines spinning. But even the Flaming Gorge lifeline only delays the harder question, because the engineering problem at Glen Canyon Dam is not just about how much water sits behind it. It is about what happens inside the dam when that water gets too low. And that problem has a name: cavitation. When the reservoir drops below 3,490 FT, the water level falls too close to the penstock intakes at 3,470 FT. The pressure driving the turbines weakens. Air begins to get sucked into the system. That air forms tiny bubbles that collapse violently against the metal turbine blades, creating shock waves that chew the equipment apart from the inside. Jack Schmidt, a river scientist at Utah State University who has studied the dam for decades, described it to KTAR News this way: "Those little air bubbles, when they explode inside the turbine, create shock waves that destroy the turbines. At minimum power pool, all 8 turbines must shut down to prevent permanent damage. Power output drops from roughly 1,320 megawatts to 0, and this is where the story takes a turn that most people following the Colorado River crisis have not heard about. Below the 8 main penstocks, there is a second set of pipes. They are called the River Outlet Works. 4 steel tubes, each 96 inches in diameter, with their intakes set at an elevation of 3,374 feet, roughly 96 feet below the turbine intakes. These pipes were originally built as a secondary release mechanism designed to dump excess water when the reservoir was nearing full. They have no generators attached. They produce no electricity. They were never meant to be the primary way of moving water through the dam. But if the turbines shut down, these 4 pipes become the only remaining path for Colorado River water to reach the Grand Canyon and every community downstream. There is just one problem: they are damaged. In April 2023, the Bureau of Reclamation used the River Outlet Works to conduct a planned high-flow experiment, sending 3,500 cubic feet per second through the pipes for 72 hours to redistribute sediment and rebuild beaches in the Grand Canyon. During that release, the pipes suffered cavitation damage. The water pressure at low reservoir levels created the same violent bubble collapse that threatens the main turbines, and it chewed into the interior lining of the outlet pipes. Inspections afterward revealed that the damage was not caused by a single event but had been accumulating over time, with the first signs of coating and pipe wall erosion documented as far back as 1965. In a March 2024 technical memo, the Bureau stated clearly that at reservoir levels below minimum power pool, there are concerns with relying on the River Outlet Works as the sole means of sustained water releases from Glen Canyon Dam. The Bureau determined it could only safely operate the outlet works when the reservoir sits at least 24 feet above dead pool, which is 30,370 feet. That narrows the usable window even further. Even with a fully functioning outlet works system, those 4 pipes can only carry a maximum combined discharge of about 15,000 cubic feet per second. That is a fraction of what the penstocks can handle. And the Bureau has acknowledged that even relining the pipes with fresh epoxy will not prevent the risk of additional cavitation at low reservoir levels. So the picture at Glen Canyon Dam right now is this: 8 turbines that shut down at 3,490 feet, 4 backup pipes that are damaged, limited in capacity, and unsafe for sustained use at low water levels, and a reservoir that is projected to drop within range of both thresholds in the next 12 months. Eric Balkin, executive director of the Glen Canyon Institute, put it in terms that cut through the technical language. This is unprecedented, but it is not unpredicted. He has called it the most predicted disaster of all time. The dam nearly failed once before, and it was not because of low water. It was because of too much. In the summer of 1983, a powerful El Niño drove a massive snowmelt across the upper basin. Inflows surged. By late June, Lake Powell was over 97% full and rising fast. Engineers began routing floodwater through the dam's 2 spillway tunnels, 41-foot diameter tubes bored through the sandstone walls on either side. Within days, operators heard violent vibrations from inside the left tunnel. Chunks of concrete and sandstone began shooting out the downstream end. Cavitation had torn a hole through the 3-foot thick, reinforced concrete lining and into the soft Navajo sandstone behind it. When crews inspected afterward, they found a cavity 32 feet deep, 150 feet long, and 30 feet wide, gouged out of the rock. On July 15th, the lake peaked at 3,708 fart, just 7 fart below the top of the dam. Engineers installed 8 fart tall metal flashboards to buy extra storage capacity. For several weeks, plywood and steel were the only things standing between the reservoir and an uncontrolled overtopping that could have sent a catastrophic flood downstream through the Grand Canyon and toward Hoover Dam. The spillways were later repaired and retrofitted with air slots. But the lesson was clear. At high water, the spillways almost failed. At low water, the outlet works are failing. The dam was designed for a reservoir that stays between roughly 3,550 and 3,700 feet. It is now operating 178 feet below the top of that range and falling toward the bottom. What makes this crisis different from anything that came before is not just the engineering. It is the politics running on top of it. The 7 states that share the Colorado River have been trying for years to negotiate new rules for how the water gets divided after the current agreements expire at the end of 2026. Those agreements, the 2007 interim guidelines, the 2019 drought contingency plans, and related deals with Mexico all run out on December 31. A new framework must be in place by October 1 when the Bureau of Reclamation issues its record of decision. The 7 states have missed every single deadline leading to that date. November 2025, missed. February 2026, missed. Summits in Las Vegas and Washington produced blame trading and press statements, but no deal. On July 31, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation released its final environmental impact statement for post-2026 operations. The preferred alternative establishes a 10-year adaptive framework running through 2036 that allows annual lower basin shortages of up to 3 million acre-feet. Annual releases from Lake Powell could range between 5 million and 12 million acre-feet, depending on conditions. Arizona, California, and Nevada would be required to cut their combined use by roughly 20% over the next 2 years. The upper basin states face only voluntary conservation measures, not mandatory cuts. Arizona's Department of Water Resources called the framework draconian, saying it would devastate the state's water users and its economy. Tom Bushatsky, director of Arizona's Department of Water Resources, has been sitting across negotiating tables from the upper basin for years, and his patience has worn through. Arizona has taken cut after cut since Tier 1 shortage kicked in, while the upper basin faces no forced reductions. Arizona has hired a high-powered law firm and sharply boosted its legal budget. If talks fail, this fight moves to federal court. The upper basin sees it differently. Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico collectively used around 4.4 million acre-feet in 2024, well below their paper entitlement of 7.5 million. They argue they should not be forced to surrender water rights they have never fully used to solve a problem they did not create. Colorado's water interests have signaled support for re-evaluating Glen Canyon Dam, but in a separate process from the post-2026 framework. Meanwhile, the Gila River Indian community, which receives Colorado River water through the Central Arizona Project, sent a letter to Reclamation stating that the United States must take action to fix Glen Canyon Dam to protect the tribe's federally recognized water rights. Governor Stephen Roe Lewis wrote those words in March of 2026. It is worth pausing on that because tribes hold some of the oldest and most powerful water rights on the Colorado River, rights that predate every state compact and every federal dam. More than 50 tribes depend on power from Glen Canyon Dam, and many depend on the river for water. The 1922 Colorado River Compact that divided the river was negotiated without a single tribal voice at the table. A century later, tribes are still fighting to have their rights honored while the infrastructure those rights depend on inches closer to failure. And there is a fight happening inside the dam itself that almost nobody outside of water policy circles has heard about. The humpback chub, a threatened fish native to the Colorado River, has lived in the Grand Canyon for millions of years. As Lake Powell dropped, the warm upper layer of the reservoir moved closer to the dam's intakes. Warmer water began passing through the dam and flowing downstream, raising the temperature of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. That warmer water created ideal spawning conditions for smallmouth bass, an invasive predator first detected reproducing below the dam in 2022. The bass eat humpback chub. To fight the invasion, Reclamation developed a program called Cool Mix Flows. Releasing cold water from deeper in the reservoir through the river outlet works to chill the river below the dam and disrupt bass spawning. The program ran in 2024 and 2025 and was considered a success. But there is a cost. The river outlet works sit below the penstocks. When water goes through those pipes, instead of the turbines, it bypasses the generators entirely. WAPA estimated that cool mix flows in 2026 alone could cost $30 to $40 million in lost power production, forcing the agency to buy replacement electricity on the open market. That cost gets passed to the cooperatives, tribes, and rural utilities that depend on cheap federal hydropower. Leslie James, who directs the Colorado River Energy Distributors Association, has warned that these costs are hitting the customers who can least afford it. A fish protection program and a power crisis are now competing for the same shrinking pool of water inside the same dam. The human cost of this crisis reaches far beyond the dam itself. In Page, Arizona, the town that exists because of Glen Canyon Dam, hotel revenue has dropped compared to previous years as Lake Powell's recreation economy shrinks. The town draws an estimated 4 million visitors a year to see Lake Powell, Antelope Canyon, Horseshoe Bend, and Rainbow Bridge. As the lake drops, boat ramps close, marinas relocate or shut down, and the landscape that drew tourists begins to look more like a construction site than a national recreation area. City officials are developing a new, low-level drinking water connection to ensure the town can still access water as the reservoir falls. One city spokesman told reporters the community has a great track record of adapting, but added plainly that the dam was never built to withstand a drought like this. 300 miles downstream, the farms of Pinal County, Arizona, have already felt what a shrinking Colorado River means. When federal shortage declarations cut Central Arizona project deliveries, farming families with the lowest priority water rights watched their fields go dry. Hundreds of acres of cotton, alfalfa, and grain land turned brown. Across roughly 200 farms in the county, an estimated 40% of acreage has been fallowed this year. Land that was green last spring sits dusty and cracked this summer. The Central Arizona Project Canal, a 336-mile concrete channel that carries Colorado River water across open desert to reach central and southern Arizona, is the lifeline for those farms and for the cities of Phoenix and Tucson beyond them. Every acre-foot of water that Glen Canyon Dam cannot release downstream is an acre-foot that may never reach that canal. And then there is the river itself. The Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean. For most of the past 25 years, the river dries up somewhere in the Sonoran Desert south of the U.S.-Mexico border, miles before it would reach the Sea of Cortez. A river that carved the Grand Canyon over 6 million years, that once spread across nearly 2 million acres of wetland at its mouth, now ends in cracked mud and salt flats. The Cocopa people, whose name translates to river people, fished and farmed the delta for centuries. Today, the river that defined their entire way of life barely reaches their land. The math underneath all of this has not changed since 1922, and that is the problem. The Colorado River Compact divided 16.5 million acre-feet per year among 7 states and Mexico based on flow data from an unusually wet period. Tree ring research spanning over 1,000 years shows the river's true long-term average is closer to 13 million acre-feet. The Bureau of Reclamation's own data in its July 2026 final EIS shows that from 2000 to 2024, average inflows came in at just 12.9 million acre-feet. Average use during the same period ran about 13.1 million acre-feet. More is going out than coming in, and it has been that way for a quarter century. Every good snow year slows the decline. Nothing has reversed it. So here is where Glen Canyon Dam stands tonight. Lake Powell sits at roughly 3,522 feet, about 22% full. The most probable federal forecast projects it at 3,507 feet by December. Under the worst case, it drops lower. Minimum power pool is 3,490 feet. The dam's 8 turbines must shut down at that level or risk destruction. The only backup system, 4 steel pipes that were never designed for sustained daily use, has already been damaged by cavitation and cannot be safely operated below 3,394 feet. The Bureau of Reclamation is draining Flaming Gorge Reservoir 400 miles upstream to buy time, but the release delays the problem rather than solving it. 7 states have failed to agree on how to share less water, and the federal government has now released a framework that could force up to 3 million acre-feet in annual lower basin cuts through 2036. Arizona calls it unacceptable. Colorado says it will go to court if it has to. The Gila River Indian community says the United States has a duty to fix the dam. Environmental groups are pushing to bypass or decommission it entirely. The deadline for a record of decision is October 1. The rules expire December 31. The reservoir is still dropping. The backup pipes are still damaged. The turbines are still spinning for now, but every foot the lake falls brings them closer to the line where the spinning stops. 5 billion kilowatt-hours a year, 5 million people, 53 tribes, one dam, 710 feet of concrete locked into sandstone, built for a river that no longer carries what it used to carry, holding back a lake that no longer holds what it was designed to hold. The water is still falling, and the line at 3,495th is not moving. If you want to see what happens when the October deadline hits and whether the states finally reach a deal or take this fight to court, subscribe. We will be here covering it.